Are you someone that just follows guides or has a favorite item build you keep going back to? Perhaps you want to adapt your builds, but don't know how. Then stay a while. This video is meant for you. Before that, here's the question of the day. If you could design a new neutral item for the game, what would it be? A good portion of the player base simply follows guides to decide their item builds and maybe consider changing up their items a little bit here and there, but mostly just build items out of habit. And it mostly works. There's a reason that they're recommended item builds and guides after all. So what's wrong with that? Well, Dota's not such a simple game. Building a really efficient set of items works for some heroes, but what about someone like Ember Spirit or most offlaners? It's not easy to tell when you should go for what item when your hero can potentially build pretty much everything. So how do you know what to build? What should you pay attention to? Fundamentally, I think the best way to approach it is by buying items to solve your problems, rather than what you ideally want to build, and your first step to building the correct items is to identify what problems you have in the match. Identifying problems is a difficult task, however, but fortunately, it's much less complicated at the start of the game than it is later on, so let's tackle the laning stage first. To start seeing problems in the game, first you have to have a plan. It's pretty hard to know what problems you'll face if you have no idea what's going to happen after all. Consider what role you're playing. For the laning stage, all three cores will be most worried about their last hits, whereas supports are going to be focused on trading and managing the lane for their core. This so far is pretty basic. Even new players will generally not make a mistake here. Where the nuance lies is knowing what wrench your specific matchup throws into the mix. For example, as an anti-mage, your general cookie-cutter starting items will look something like 2 tangos, a quelling blade, a circlet, a branch, and a fairy fire. Let's say you're up laning against the duo of Legion Commander and Invoker, while your support is Witch Doctor. Their lane is going to pressure you constantly, which means you just can't AFK farm. Now you have a problem, and the solution is going to be to adjust your starting items. One plan could be to accept that you're going to take a lot of damage for last hits, and just buy more regen than you'd normally want to. So you buy a casual ring of regen instead of stats, maybe even 2 of them. Then your items end up as 2 rings of regen, a quelling blade, and a set of tangos. But maybe you aren't a player that likes to play passive, so your plan will be to burn out all of their mana so you can farm in peace later. Then you can start with an Orb of Venom and ask your support to buy a salve for you. Which plan you should choose better depends on what kind of a player you are. The more important part is to play to your plan. If your solution to the problem is more regen, then don't try to be super aggressive. Just sit back and enjoy your farm. If you went for the Orb of Venom, sitting back and farming will lose you the lane, so go and trade hits as often as you can. Let's examine the same matchup from the perspective of the Witch Doctor. Your goal for the laning stage is to get as much farm for your anti-mage as you can. Since the enemy lane is much stronger than you, one of the most important jobs you've got is to keep the equilibrium close to your tower. That will involve a lot of pulling and preventing the enemy position 4 from pulling, but you've got a problem. Fighting a Quaswex Invoker with your Maledict is ineffective because of his regen and Legion Commander's heal, so how do you adjust to be able to do your job? By default, your item build should include a lot of stats and minimal mana regen since you are mainly using Cask and your auto attacks in lane, which don't demand a lot of mana. However, since Maledict is ineffective, in this lane the plan will be to put a value point in your heal and buy a lot of mana regen. So your adjusted item build should be something like 2 tangos, 2 mangoes, a salve, a clarity, and a few branches. Another problem is that your anti-mage might not be able to kill range creeps by himself if he's getting pressured all the time. This is something that you can solve by using your cask on range creeps to secure them yourself. Overall, your plan will be to put pressure on the Legion Commander and have enough sustain to not be bullied by the Invoker. Pull the lane whenever it pushes out. These were examples of 2 completely different roles, but you can see that the way we came up with the solutions is very similar. This is going to be true for all 5 roles. The pipeline to come up with solutions is to have a rough plan, see how your specific matchup messes with the plan, and what items you can buy to solve those problems. In the context of the laning stage, this was very simple, but as you go later into the game, you'll need to consider a lot more angles. What is important though, is the way you arrive to the correct answers always stays very similar. For another example, let's see a different match. Here we have a Doom on the Radiant right after the laning phase with just drums and phase boots. Radiant has a number of problems. Their teamfight is weaker, the enemy has overwhelming amounts of magical damage, someone needs to catch the Arc Warden when he's split pushing, and the only hero that can start fights is Rubik, who doesn't want to. For the Arc Warden, Shadowblade might be the answer, but for the team fighting, Pipe is great. On the other hand, having no initiation makes any engagement hard, so Blink is also necessary. So how do we know which problem to solve? This is where your plan comes in. Looking at the lineups, any fight that goes on for a long time is going to be really difficult for Radiant, since the team is full of squishy heroes against a ton of AoE magical damage. Therefore, the team wants to take short fights, so the plan will be to jump in, doom a target, and finish the fight as soon as we can. The main problem with that plan is the lack of initiation, so Blink Dagger will be the best item choice here. After the blink, what problems are left is the doom. Mainly that once he blinks in and dooms, he's either going to run out or die, so a defensive item is needed. But which one? We've alluded before that the enemy mainly deals magical damage, so Pipe seems like the obvious solution here. But remember the game plan. Radiant favors short fights, so rather than trying to sustain through Venomancer with a pipe, it's much better approach to buy a BKB. As a reminder, it's important to keep playing what you built. Before the BKB, it was really important to open the fight with Doom to make sure he gets it off, but since he isn't going to die anymore, jumping into stun without using Doom and just running at someone is a viable option. After a few good fights, Radiant got ahead and had no issues winning team fights anymore. The main problem now was dealing with the split push of Dire, so catching heroes on the map was the main issue, therefore the Doom built a Shadow Blade next to make those pickoffs much easier. To summarize that match, what we looked at was first, how does the team fight? Second, how does Doom personally fit into that? And third, which of the problems are the most important to deal with first? For the third example, we'll look at an Ember Spirit game. With a hero with very well-rounded kits like Ember Spirit, you usually don't have problems in the game yourself unless there's hard lockdown on the enemy team you need to dispel. You will want to figure out what your team lacks and address that problem. Let's go through the same process as before. This time around, it's Radiant who wants to take short fights, and Dire has to survive the Chrono and Phoenix Egg, then clean up. So how does he as the Ember Spirit fit into that? He can't really itemize against the Chronosphere, so his role is going to be to deal with the hard-to-kill targets of the Radiant, in this case, the Void and the Necro. Since most heroes are weak to a Spirit Vessel, his first item is going to be that. In fights, since he really wants to avoid the Chrono, he is playing really defensive until Chrono is used, and only commits to his targets afterwards. Since even with a Spirit Vessel, he has a hard time killing his targets, the lack of damage isn't really solved yet, and so he builds a second damage item. This time around, since his targets are the same, he has to consider the items of the Void and the Necro to see what defensive items they went for. The Necro has a hood and another shawl, while Void opted for a manta, so he decides to go physical damage and build a Desolator. After solving the damage problem, what's left? In fights, even though he has enough damage to dive in and kill someone, he prefers to take it slow and poke at people from the back because he has to be afraid of getting silenced and stunned by the Earth Spirit or bursted by the Necro Ultimate. To solve that, he's going to opt for a BKB as no other defensive item helps him against both the Necro and the Earth Spirit. Overall, what we saw in 3 games is 4 different roles at different stages of the game that can be analyzed in the same way when it comes to item builds. Some heroes, like the Anti-Mage, an example, might only need to adapt his items in the lane, since the problem the hero faces are pretty much the same every game because of how specialized his kit is. That means you'll almost always go Battle Fury Manta and Abyssal Blade with some exceptions, but for most heroes, it's very useful to be able to adapt your item build for your matches based on the problems that you have to deal with in your game. Remember that it's also important to play into what items you build, otherwise you might not solve your problems at all. Building damage items and diving into fights like a madman, or looking for fights after building farming items won't magically win you games, even if it's the correct build. That's gonna be it for today. I hope this guide has helped you re-examine your item builds and that you can implement this mindset into your games. Good luck with your matches, and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already.